Okay, welcome back to the second part of the overview of Gorski's relapse prevention model. In this section, we're going to talk about post-acute withdrawal, referred to as PAWS. This kind of collection of symptoms that uh, increases the risk for relapse and is a natural part of the rebuilding of the brain and the body and the heart as they're moving into recovery. We'll look at the stages or the progression of recovery, basically answering the question of how long does it take and how are those phases stretched out. In your handout, I have some specific things that are kind of focuses for each of those stages. Also, we will discuss the 5 basic rules of recovery and how those are kind of core pieces to what we're doing and how we keep reiterating those 5 basic rules that they can live by. We will review the individual recovery program development and what does an individual recovery program work. So when someone says, hey, I'm just working my program, or you just need to work your program and I'll work mine, it's the idea that they have developed some certain elements that they are using to have that healthy and fulfilling life without negative behaviors. And then lastly, we'll look at relapse as a cycle rather than an event. And Gorski proposes kind of 11 steps or stages in the development of a relapse. So before a reuse happens, there's all these other things that are going on. And what role does relapse management play in recovery? So just a quick reminder that when someone is dealing with addiction, this is a disease, that it's chronic, and recovery is putting your disease into remission because your brain has been hooked, hijacked, and hacked. There are actually biological things that are going on that are not just contributing or prompting impulsive and destructive choices, but that are actually taking over the brain and causing these behaviors to happen. We also want you to remember that the changes in the brain that have happened as a result of addiction and compulsion or just a repetitive use, they persist when you stop using. And it takes some time, sometimes up to 2 years before the brain really has restored itself to its full capacity or its baseline capacity and able to adjust and function. So when you think about the changes that happen over the period of someone's substance compulsive use, you see that there's this kind of degrading of what they're able to do neurologically below the baseline, and then they stop using. And where this red line begins is that point of where they stop using, and it takes a while for them to build back up. So the brain changes because of substance use persist, and those brain changes persist again for up to 2 years, letting clients understand that, hey, this is why relapse is so common. This is why it's such a significant issue for us to address. This is really what recovery involves, is how you're putting patterns in your life to mitigate or to work through these post-acute withdrawal experiences or symptoms that you're having. And as they move progressively closer and closer to normal baseline, people obviously will feel better and better. So this concept of post-acute withdrawal syndrome is kind of a hallmark of Gorski's work. PAWS is a biopsychosocial syndrome, a combination of damage from alcohol or drugs to the nervous system. It's the psychosocial stress of coping with life without drugs or alcohol. So as normal life, the normal psychosocial stresses of life enter into everyone's experience, when there is no longer the drugs or the alcohol, then the body experiences and the heart experiences and the mind experiences these extra measures of symptomology that could be so difficult for them to navigate. So here are 6 symptoms that are often associated with post-acute withdrawal. The inability to think clearly, so there's kind of a maybe foggy brain. The things are a little harder to recall. Things are harder to organize. Decision-making may be slower than they remember it being in the past. Definitely slower than when they were used, if they were using some kind of speed. Memory problems. they can recall a limited short-term memory, maybe gaps in other types of memory. Their working memory may be small as well, so they can only hold a handful of pieces of data at a time while they're working with it. So they're going to have some coping mechanisms, using a scrap piece of paper while you're working through calculations, or learning to take notes at meetings that you normally would have just in the past maybe just listened to, or you hope you could just sit there and remember it, not depending on that. So there's some coping things, because memory will be hampered. It will take some time for that to restore. Emotional overreactions or numbness. So this kind of emotional irregularity. In substance use, we're using substances to kind of quench this kind of movement of emotion. Now emotions begin to move. We respond to them because sometimes they can be uncomfortable, or we don't know what to do with them. Maybe we never knew what to do with them even before substance abuse. But basically, there's an over-response to emotions, both our own emotions and the emotions around us. Or it can be like just the flip side of that, where they have days where they're just numb. Basically, their body's saying, I can't handle another emotion from somebody else or even from myself. So there's a sense of numbness that they have. They could have continued sleep disturbances. They could even have physical coordination problems, eye-hand coordination problems. So maybe even just if they're doing some complex or their handwriting, those kind of motor coordination skills. And then their sensitivity to stress can be real high. So their ability to kind of put up with things that they may have been able to put up with because they were using a substance, they're not able to put up with. So they have an extra sensitivity. These are normal things. The reality is that when somebody stops using, they had gotten to the point where using substances helped them feel normal, and they moved normal way below. And so when they stop using, they're just a lot of reasons for them to not be comfortable, for them to be even, you might say, miserable. And so there is this season where they're dealing with these types of post-acute withdrawal symptoms, and they can experience them in basically 4 different ways. The first way is a regenerative, meaning things are getting better. So they start off and their pause symptoms are real high, but as each week goes around, their pause symptoms begin to get lesser and lesser and lesser, which means that they're moving up toward a normal baseline. But there's a regeneration going on. There's a rebuilding of the body, and they're beginning to experience it in different areas. Or sometimes there's a degenerative experience, meaning they stop using substances, they experience a little bit of pause, but then the pause just seems to be getting worse over the days or the weeks or the months. This obviously is making it harder to maintain to maintain sobriety, to stay out of relapse cycle, but it gets worse before it gets better. And I think that's something that many clients have reflected, is that they are doing okay initially, and then they hit a month or 2 where they feel like their pause symptoms are actually getting worse. All of that degenerative pause, which this getting worse, is all in preparation for improvement. However, they have to be able to manage their life through it. A third kind of experience of pause is the stable. Basically, this is what it's like, and it kind of stays this way for a month, 2 months, 6 months, and they're just having to cope with it until they finally have enough healing of the body and of the brain, so they start having a regenerative or a decline in their pause symptoms. And lastly, there's a type where you've gone through a couple of months, the pause symptoms begin to decline rapidly, but then suddenly they reoccur in these little spikes. These little spikes of reoccurrence could be because of external stressors changing. It could be because they've gotten a virus or a bacteria. So all of a sudden, there's a short return to pause symptoms. And again, those are the things that put people at risk for being in the relapse cycle and potentially not exiting the relapse cycle. So what are some basic things that people can do to manage these post-acute withdrawal syndrome symptomologies. Okay. We remember that a recovery program is a daily program. So, because everyone is probably going to experience pause to some degree or another, they're working and establishing a program that's theirs that they do every single day so that they're doing some of these things every day to manage pause and to reorganize their life. So here are a list of several things that can be direct kind of responses to some of the symptoms. First of all, stabilization. What do they need if they're sick of their stomach, if they're have a crisis, they've lost their employment, they need to find employment, something to help stabilize what's going on. Whatever kind of the chaos is currently, what is the goal to stabilizing that? Maybe it's even just setting out a schedule, or it's solving a problem that needs to happen. It's getting closer and being with more people so that you have more self-protective factors so that you exit the relapse cycle. Anyways, any way that there can be a sense of stabilization. Secondly is verbalization. This is when they're actually talking about what they're feeling, what they're thinking, and they're able to spell out and say what their problem is. Being able to put things in words. One of the best ways that human beings have for self-regulation is through verbalization. We are a speaking people. So as you speak and say things, you actually are able to minimize or decrease the impact of the stressor. So good, healthy verbalizations, a good development of a vocabulary, and a comfort and the self-esteem necessary to be able to say things, putting yourself in social environments that make a difference. That's why in mutual support groups where you're going in and you're doing 90 meetings in 90 days, or you're going to treatment 4 times a week, you're sitting in a group and you're talking about where you are, those verbalization exercises help reduce pause symptoms, and it helps you to establish a fulfilling and healthy life without negative behaviors. Ventilation is another one. Ventilation is a way of kind of utilizing and turning the energy to a positive. Ventilation is not getting a punching bag and just, hitting it as hard as you can, or throwing something, or hitting your head up against the wall, or that's not ventilation. That really is escalation. Ventilation is being able to take the physical things that you're feeling and give them a healthy outlet. Exercise is a good one. Running is a good one. Handwork is a good one. Sometimes just some manual labor is a good one. So you're actually able to take your body sensations and give them. Stretching is another good ventilation exercise. Things that you're doing so that the physical responses are actually able to be expressed. Ventilation is not screaming and shouting. Okay, actually, some ventilation is saying what is irritating you in a calm, peaceful way. It actually allows the calmness, the sereneness of your brain to kick in and come alongside the problem. Most people think about ventilation as, I'm going to scream and shout, I just needed to get it out. Well, that has escalated and left you full of cortisol. It has not invited the parts of your brain and the neurochemistry that actually brings you a sense of feeling of contentment alongside of it. So good ventilation training. Reality testing, what's really going on? How do you get more objective? We get tunnel vision when we have pause symptoms and we're not seeing the whole story. We kind of need to get a bigger picture. This usually happens from talking from somebody else and saying, here's what I'm seeing. What do you see? Problem solving and sitting down and maybe doing pros and cons list, brainstorming about possible solutions. How would you kind of do a mental check of projecting what actions would be? These aren't skills that people always necessarily have well developed, where they can problem solve, where they're actually able to say, okay, let me come up with 5 scenarios. Now let me pick one and let me project or do some mental time travel. What would it be like if I did this, 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 and this? And they can project a potential result of an action and therefore then determine whether or not it's a good action. Some people don't do that. They're impulsive. They just go with what seems immediate. So some good problem solving skills and some problem solving training. Goal setting, what is it that you really want to do? Limiting those goals, making those goals realistic, and then doing smaller goals rather than larger goals so that you're able to actually have a sense of accomplishment. Goal setting is a huge piece. When you're living healthier, you can sometimes go without goal setting, especially for like daily activities. But in the first 5 years of recovery, you might need to set a goal every morning. This is what my goal is today, or these are what my 5 goals are for today. And goal setting helps you stay on track. And you say, no matter what I'm feeling, I'm just going to follow my goals. What's the pathway that my goals set out for today? That's what I'm going to do. Backtracking is another way. It's going backwards and picking up things you did earlier in recovery to stabilize, verbalize, ventilate, etc. So you're stepping back. So maybe you did 60 meetings in 60 days when you first started in recovery. The pause symptoms have gotten worse. So you're going to go back, instead of going to a meeting once a week at Celebrate Recovery, you're going to go back and you can do meetings 3 days a week. So you do a backtracking for a period of time until the pause symptoms begin to decline. So those are all specific ways that you can respond to pause. And part of both psychoeducation, group therapy, individual counseling is training and coaching and helping people, kind of helping them process through these skills that are all part of managing pause. So let's turn our attention to the stages of recovery. And what does it really look like in the big picture, kind of a global picture of what it is for someone to go through recovery. Recovery is not 28 days. Sometimes people say, well, just put me in rehab. I'd rather do it in 28 days than outpatient in 15 months. And I'm like, well, just because you're here every day doesn't mean that the process happens faster. In fact, I would tell you, you cannot speed up recovery. You might be able to slow it down by not engaging, but you can't speed it up. There's a max speed in which that it's going to be accomplished, and you can't avoid. So there's some timelines that are unavoidable. And part of developing your own personal program, part of working and becoming a person that's living in recovery is accepting those, the amount of time that you're giving yourself to recover. And so accepting time and accepting the stages of recovery is key to living in recovery. So here are Gorski's stages of recovery. Now, sometimes you might see these, some different titles, but they're always basically these same 6. In fact, I'll show you another William White stages of recovery in just a moment. But here's Gorski's. And he's going to tell you what the central theme is for each of these. So number 1, the first stage is transition. This is the stage in which you're recognizing your addiction. This stage can be 1 month, 2 years. How long does it take for you to recognize that you have an addiction and you actually are going to do something about it? The next stage after transition is stabilization. This is where you're detoxing from the substance. So you've started to abstain from it, and you're recuperating. So you're recuperating from the immediate physical results. You're recuperating from kind of the number of negative choices that you have made, some of the reactions that other people have had. So this could be legal issues, relational issues, employment issues, medical issues, all these things that are kind of tied up in this stabilization. Stabilization typically is at least 30 days. Sometimes it's 60 days. It could even be 90 days. Depends on how chaotic your life has become, how much recuperation needs to happen. Now, I'm not saying that you solve all your problems in stabilization. What happens in stabilization is the immediacy of the crisis is removed. You still have a lot of repair work to do, but you're able to get to a baseline, right? Your issue is no longer acute. You're not still nauseated and vomiting all day long. So you actually are now able to go to work. So that's kind of a good example of this stabilization phase. When you're in residential treatment, it's almost 100% stabilization. We're basically rebooting body, brain, and heart. And we're utilizing a controlled environment in order to do that, in order that we can get that detoxification done, we can get some recuperation started, and we can start setting the framework for your own development of a recovery program. Once you finish stabilization, you move into early recovery. This is where you start to change your addictive thoughts, your addictive feelings, and your addictive behaviors. I don't know of this ever happening faster than 3 months. I can't find anyone that's going to claim that with any kind of, I think, validity and reliability. So your early recovery can be at least 3 months, but it could be as easily up to 6 months. Again, it depends on how fractured your life had become. So 3 months to 6 months is a time period where you're making all these radical changes. You've developed a personal program, you're testing it, you're modifying it, you're putting some pieces together. You are typically really protecting. There's a lot of self-protective factors during early recovery because your pause symptoms are typically the most intense during this period of time. And you're really working it hard. This is the 90 meetings in 90 days kind of thing, where no, it's all about recovery. Everything yields to it. And I'm making my recovery the foundation of who I am as an individual. Once you finish early recovery in that 3 months to 6 month period, you move into the middle recovery. In middle recovery, lifestyle balance begins to happen. In early recovery, you may have stayed at part-time work, but in middle recovery, you can go to full-time work. This is a simple example. Or you were out of school during early recovery, you're going to go back into school full-time for middle recovery, something of that sort. Relationships that have been separated, so a lot of times people are separated during early recovery, they actually move back into relationship in middle recovery, so they're beginning to set a lifestyle balance. Work, relationships, family, etc. Focus is on balance. And then that middle recovery typically is up through 1 year, all right? You almost have to hit the 1 year mark. In fact, I'm going to say that you have to hit the 1 year mark to be in before you can leave middle recovery, because that way you've done all the first. You've done the first 4th of July, the first New Year's Eve, the first birthday celebration. You've done all your first, and you've been able to balance yourself in that. And you think, okay, I've got this real rhythm, and my life is very kind of stable now. And that's kind of a signifier after you hit that 1 year mark that you're moving into late recovery. And late recovery is when family of origin issues really begin to be overcome. You may become aware of them during stabilization, but they don't really get kind of worked out. Now, family of origin is, how did you grow up? So a year later, you're working on some of those issues that are kind of core issues that are embedded even into your personality. And that, I think, is a key factor. You're now so healthy that you can do that in late recovery. Now, late recovery is also is where you give it away. You're actually usually actively involved in giving things away and helping another addict. And so there's still a lot of newness. Late recovery happens through 5 years, all right? And so once you hit the 5 year mark, you can then move potentially, maybe not, but has to at least get there. 5 year mark, you can move into that maintenance, where you're just kind of growing and developing through the lifespan and maintaining this healthy and fulfilling life without any negative behaviors. Late recovery is also the period, if you'll recall in part 1, where we talked about that some people go 3 years without use and then relapse. That's why late recovery has that 5 year mark before you move into maintenance. You want to have reduced that risk. And what is honest about each of these stages, honestly, you change your program. There may be some key things, but there's some real big shifts in your personal recovery program in each of those stages as you continue to get healthier and more whole and more equipped just to manage life as well as your chronic disease. Now, William White uses some different words, but basically has the same things. If you take a look at it here, you can see he calls transition precovery, which I think is kind of a neat term. Then he calls our stabilization phase recovery initiation. That's where you're stabilized. And then you start early recovery. He uses that same term. Then he calls it sustained recovery, which is what we're calling middle. And then he calls it long-term recovery. We're calling it late. And then after that is maintenance. And you can see some of the markers there and some of the different things that happen in each of the stages. And you have this in your handout packet as well. So this is not just novel to Gorski. Other people that have worked in the field of substance abuse kind of acknowledge this. And I will say too that this is the understanding of recovery that goes right along with the years of history that we've seen with 12-step programs. So what are the key rules? And Gorski has these 5 rules, and I have come to appreciate them and like their simplicity, but they're also comprehensive. We actually give our clients out a little card that has the 5 on it. Here's the 5 rules. And almost if you don't know what to do, if you do one of these 5 things, you're gonna be successful. So what are the 5 rules? Number 1, ask for help. Addicts typically do not ask for help. So learning how to ask for help, when to ask for help, and then how to receive the help that you've asked for, okay? Be completely honest. When you're in addiction, deception is a way of life. You deceived others, you've deceived yourself, and being completely honest is so pivotal. Number 3, change your life. You're not going to recover if you're not willing to change your life. If you just want to stop drugs and then keep your life going the way it was, you may have a period of abstinence, but the statistics are stacked against you that you're not going to be able to hold off very long without a major change to your life. So you're looking about changing who you are. And this is, again, why you have these long periods of time. That's why treatment and recovery is not 28 days. It's intense for 15 months. That's almost a year and a half. And then it changes, and you're keep changing your life till you get to that healthy, fulfilling good life that you want that doesn't have negative behaviors. Practice self-care. What are you doing to take care of yourself? How are you making your sobriety and your program the number 1 thing? And this is not easy. There will be many people in the client's life that want them to get this over with and then get back to doing what they want or how they want. But the client is going to have to learn to choose their program over what their relationships want and need. And that's hard for them. Their program comes first. That's not a sense of selfishness. That's a sense of they have to take care of themselves because they're the ones responsible for the recovery. Your partner, your friend, your parents, even your children, they are not the ones responsible for a client's recovery. The client is. So self-care is their responsibility. And they will often have to learn to tell these other people no and yield to their self-care so that their program is maintained. The last one is don't bend the rules. Don't bend these rules and don't bend any rules. Addicts are known to break rules or manipulate and use rules in their own favor. We want to make sure that we follow rules. If the speed limit is 55, we drive 55. Why? Because that's the rule. And when we follow the rules, our life moves to that healthy and fulfilling place that we want it to be in. So those are the 5 rules that we echo in the relapse prevention model. So everyone, I've said this several times, develops their own program, okay? And you can call it a personal program, you can call it a recovery program, a recovery plan. Now, for those of you that are clinicians, let me remind you that we're not talking about their treatment plan. Although these things will show up on their treatment plan, the treatment is something that you, as a professional, design to provide services with a client and make sure that the client is kind of engaged in that process. But once you're done treating that client, that treatment plan is dissolved. A recovery program, an individual's program, goes on, and they're the ones that are constantly shaping it and adapting it. And sometimes it includes a professional, and sometimes it will not include a professional. So what does a recovery program look like? All right. Well, there are 7 zones that a recovery program has something in it. So a good, robust recovery program is a set of habits or practices that have been put together. And there's at least one practice in each of these 7 areas. There's something in education and training, some area of growth. There's something about self-protection that's going on. There's something about nutrition. There's something about exercise. There's something about relaxation. There's something about spirituality. And there's something about balanced living. Those are the 7 zones. A program for recovery that someone's adopting or drafting for themselves, if it skips one of these, it's missing a piece, okay? And they're increasing their chance of relapse. Balanced life means you've come in and you've done something for each of these. Now, what you choose in a particular zone, you could, some activities can be used in multiple zones. The issue is, do you know why you're using it? All right, I'll give you an example. Education and training or growth. You could be going to a mutual support group for that. But you could also be going to a mutual support group for spirituality. If you're aware and intentional that you're using mutual support group for growth and spirituality, then you can use that single habit. That single habit does a double duty. I go to group every night because I'm doing these 2 things. Later on, that program may be modified or adjusted, and they may say, you know what, for spirituality, I now have joined a spiritual group. I've joined a church, all right? But I still go once a week or 2 times a week to an NA group for education and training. So things adjust, but the key is, are we addressing all 7 zones, all right? Most of these, I think, are understandable. I want to say something about spirituality and balanced living. These are the ones that may be less easily identifiable and familiar. Spirituality is not just church. Spirituality may involve church, but it need not. When we talk about spirituality, we're talking about things that are bigger than ourselves, called metaphysics, the things that kind of shape our values and that give meaning in life. So things bigger than ourselves, things that shape value, and things that give meaning. When we engage in those things, then that's called developing our spirituality. Now, for those of you that, if you have a church background, you can say, okay, there are basic religious systems out there, whether it's Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, Hinduism, Islam. These things have a place where people identify meaning, value, and something bigger than themselves. But it need not be an organized religion. It could be anything that is a pursuit for them, that they derive this sense of meaning, value, and greater than themselves. So their development of their own spirituality is important. Research has indicated that people don't just need God, but they need to believe that one of the activators of improved self-control, improved willpower, is the ability to believe. When you exercise, have the ability, and then you exercise belief, you're actually enhancing neurochemical responses, psychological frameworks, and you're able to follow through with the things that you set, the goals that you set. So spirituality is very diverse. It can be very traditional, but it need not be. All right. Lastly is balanced living. Balanced living is, do I know how to do things in moderation? Can I practice moderation? Can I practice delaying self-gratification? Can I feel the minor impulse to drink a Diet Coke and say, no, you know what? I've decided I'm only going to have one Diet Coke a week, and I can tell myself no. A sense of balance living, even things that may be healthy, can you do them in a moderate way? So finding moderation and practicing moderation and saying no to those kind of self-gratifying things that you want immediately, or even just delaying them. What are you doing to have balanced living? Examples of activities in balanced living could be keeping a schedule. It could be having a morning routine. It could be practicing gratitude. It could be doing morning inventories and evening inventories. That's also potentially self-protective behaviors. It's also potentially growth. Could be spirituality. You can see some of these things can fit in multiple places, and that's okay, as long as we know and the client knows that I'm doing this to meet the need in this particular zone. So if you're a clinician, you're going to be sitting down, walking with them and saying, what are these things? Let's come up with a behavior that's in each of these in each of these zones, so that and that's your plan, that's your program. We put those on a piece of paper, we scan them into the chart, it becomes part of their treatment. But they're going to keep modifying it on their own as they go through all 6 stages of recovery, constantly adjusting it and fulfilling it. And so if you're an educator, you're doing a group, you need to understand what these zones are. You need to be able to talk about them. You need to talk about how to apply them so that people can really understand, this is what my program is, and I need to work my program. In residential treatment, you'll discover that we introduce all 7 of these, and we actually have them practicing them without them knowing it. So you can always refer back to that and say, well, remember if they were in residential treatment, remember you set goals in the morning? This is why. Remember you did a review at the end of the day? This is why. All right. Those are just ways of exposing them to what these are. If you work with someone that's only outpatient, you're going to have to spend some more time and really monitor closely how they are practicing some of these elements that are going to be in their personal program. The other thing is these things that are selected for their personal program can go right into their FCC app, and you can schedule them, and they can track them. Did I do them? Am I doing them? Am I modifying my program, etc.? So it's really an effective way to do that. Recovery is a process. It's like climbing a hill. There are ups and downs. Often some form of relapse happens in this process. It is likely that that's going to be what happens. People are going to experience some measure of relapse. So let's talk about relapse. You can't separate relapse from recovery, because relapse is not an event. Relapse is a process. And many times relapse is happening subconsciously more than consciously. So relapse is a process. Here's the definition. It's not an event. In order to understand relapse prevention, you have to understand the stages of relapse. Relapse starts weeks or even months before an event of a physical reuse. In this page, you will learn how to use specific relapse prevention techniques for each stage of relapse. So you're going to actually say, here are the 11 stages. Here are some specific reactions that you can do to those 11 stages. So you can counteract the process that this develops. Relapse happens with an emotional response, feelings, mental response, thoughts. Then it starts happening behaviorally. There's physical responses that take place. So someone could be going along in their recovery, and they might go quite well. They get through stabilization, they're through early recovery, they're in middle recovery, and they're actually even after middle recovery. They're past that 1 year mark, and all of a sudden some extra stressors enter in. They get injured, and so they're having to take medicine. Their bodies, they've gotten dehydrated, and they're having some more pause, symptoms return, but they're ignoring it. They're denying that it's really happening. So they begin this cycle of moving down. Stressors continue to increase, and then they continue to have more and more difficulties. They start going back to substitute compulsions. They start beginning compulsive about working or binge watching television or whatever. And next thing you know, they're leading closer and closer and closer to an actual reuse of a substance. But if they become aware, they can break the cycle, okay? And they can step out of the relapse process and maintain their recovery. And sometimes without ever, a reuse of a substance is not inevitable when you're in relapse. You can step out of the relapse cycle at any time that you want. So what is that relapse cycle? What are the sequences of events that happen? It begins first with unhealthy emotions. These are feelings that are happening, whether they're negative feelings or even kind of like weird sense of euphoria. Sometimes the unhealthy emotion is an infatuation. A new person enters your life, you're infatuated with them, you don't know how to manage infatuation very well, so suddenly you're giving yourself away in ways you should not be giving yourself away, and that unhealthy emotion just stirs. It sets you up for the next phase, which is denial. Ignoring the fact that, wow, I have all these unmanaged emotions moving around. I don't really know what to do with them. I've never really dealt with them well in the past, and I'm just feeling them, but I'm going to say, no, I'm really okay. Everything's all right. I'm fine. So denial is the next thing that happens. Very rarely do people actually say, oh, I'm having an unhealthy emotion. What do I do? They deny first, and then they realize they're in denial, or they begin a compulsive behavior, and that's more often when they begin to come out and recognize that they're in this relapse phase. So compulsive behaviors, again, these are just things that you're doing impulsively or compulsively. Eating more, over-exercising, starting to shop more than you should be shopping. So these are negative behaviors. Then you get into triggers. These are when suddenly you're having these experiences that have intensified, and you are looking for them. So sometimes when people are being triggered, there's an anticipatory element to it. So I'm walking down the road and I don't just see a needle and say, oh, that reminds me of when I use. You look down at the needle and see, walking down the road, you look down and see the needle and you feel a rush. There's an anticipation. I wonder if I'm going to see another needle. I'm wondering if I can and you find yourself preoccupied. So there's a sense of anticipation and preoccupation that comes with triggers. And these triggers can be directly related to a substance, or they could be related to relationships or social context that once were precursors to you using. All right. The next thing is these triggers then move you into interior chaos. The emotions start pinging, you're having reactions, you're irritable, and then that goes into external turmoil. You start to actually create problems around you. This is another time that many people finally become aware is they've started to have conflicts with their significant others. They find that they start talking about their boss and everybody's against them, and they realize that, wait a minute, they are creating some of this turmoil that they are blaming everybody else for. And they have a moment of clarity, and they say, you know what? I'm in the relapse cycle. I need to exit. Then there's, if they don't exit, they move into loss of control. Then they're starting to have consequences. They're having anger outbursts. They're not managing their money. They may lose a job. If you're still in denial, these loss of controls seem to be the result of how evil and bad the world is, rather than how you're making your own choices that are leading to these kinds of losses. That goes into addictive thinking. The same way you created an entire framework of thinking, that all police officers are bad, all laws are ridiculous, you're the victim, or all these negative thoughts about yourself. I could never do this, so I might as well use all the rationalizations for substance use. The addictive thinking comes back, and those are the leaders into, I'm going to start hanging out in the places or with the people or doing the things that are high risk for me. And that is what happens right before there's a reuse. And then after a reuse, however long you engage in that, there's all the aftermath of that actual reuse, whether it's relational, economic, or legal, as you begin to rebuild yourself back into the recovery mode. So those are the 11 steps, and they're all in a sequence. They move through, and this is what relapse is. Many of these steps happen in the subconscious level. They're under the radar or under the water. You don't see them. All right. You're learning, if you're in recovery or if you're a provider, you're learning to help people understand what these 11 steps are and to identify them, and then how to respond. How do you respond to each of those? And we spend an enormous amount of time in groups and in psychoeducation working on this. And you may even in individual counseling have to really spend some time helping someone manage their own relapse cycle. Managing their relapse, okay, at any of these stages is about maintaining their recovery. And it's about that fulfilling and healthy life. And so they're constantly moving toward it. People can be in relapse for a long time and just holding on because they haven't gotten to number 10 yet, but they can exit it at any time. The earlier they exit, the lower their risk of reoccurring. So what does treatment include when we talk about treatment? Treatment tracks the stage of recovery. The intensity level of treatment is based on the severity of the addiction, other comorbid addictions, and how available the client is. We use motivational interviewing and the stages of change as they move through each stage of recovery. Transition, stabilization, early, middle, and late. We're using motivational interviewing and the stages of change through every single one of them with every single task that they're having to do. All right, so what do they do when someone goes in recovery, and what are we doing when we're doing professional treatment? We're developing relapse prevention plans. And that means that in each stage of their recovery, we're developing a plan to what do I do when I relapse? Now, again, not when you reuse, when they're in that relapse mode. What do they do when they're in relapse mode? So they never get to number 10, the reuse. And they're developing a personalized recovery program that includes something in those 7 zones. And that something in the 7 zones are always expressed as a habit. You're teaching them 7 habits that are part of their program. A habit that can be tracked on a calendar or on a chart, and we can use the FCC app and they can track it. Things that they're doing as a habit that lead to a healthy, fulfilling life without the negative behaviors of either substance use or other compulsive behaviors that have brought destruction in their life. So that's the overview, of the Gorski model. And the next sessions, we're going to talk more in depth about the model from a big picture view. We'll look at those 11 things in more detail and how that process happens and how to intervene. We'll talk about treatment planning and how treatment plans are designed to coordinate with your Gorski model. We'll look at other key factors of instruction and training, and I'm going to even develop for you a step-by-step if you're an individual counselor. You do this, 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 and this. so you can see a sequence of what you're doing as you're moving people through their development. And remember, we have a model that happens across the board with everybody that we treat. This is how we treat people. We can measure the fidelity of whether we're doing our job. The individuality comes in their specific relapse plan and their specific program for recovery. All right. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you next time.